How do you delicious people? It's your birthday, and you're going to have fun. Well, in this movie, Willy's Wonderland, I had a lot of fun watching this film. Reasonably, to me, a lot of people could say that this movie quite possibly copies and pastes a lot of Five Nights at Freddy things. Ultimately, a lot of people could say that this movie is really dark for a Nicolas Cage film. When honestly looking at it, evidently you've never seen Nicolas Cage play in the movie Mandy well before Nicolas Cage was even doing this film. Reasonably, this is actually in Nicolas Cage's warehouse to do kind of this kind of film. When looking at it, I really just had so much fun watching this film. I was ultimately just enjoying this kind of had a little bit of old fashioned horror flavor to me. I really like the way of which that eventually we have it to where it being quasi like Five Nights at Freddy, where it's not like the monsters all attacked at one time. It seemed like every single time it was one monster or one animatronic after the other. Reasonably, I liked the fact that reasonably there was some real true backstory. There was an attempt at helping us understand the approach of this film. It wasn't that all of a sudden the animatronics one day just came to life. No, there was an actual backstory, and I could appreciate this film for doing that. Ultimately, where can you go to see Willy's Wonderland? Well, it's ultimately a premiere kind of thing on Amazon right now for about $20. Ultimately, you say that this movie. Ultimately, you can see that you can see this movie for absolutely free if you go on to a Movie Pro or Movie Playbox or some other place that otherwise has a movie app to dare in fact watch this. Or probably maybe like a TV Crush, I don't know. But anyways, I ultimately saw it on Movie Pro, and ultimately I went in and saw it, and I was like, yeah, I was so pumped about watching this film, and ultimately after, because ultimately somebody had showcased it on a trailer on my Facebook, and then ultimately I saw it, and I'm like, oh my god, I gotta share this right away to tell people that this movie exists, because it looks freaking hilarious. Ultimately, I went in and saw the trailer of it beforehand, because a lot of times I'll just accidentally see things. I heard that this movie was going to be a thing, but ultimately I didn't know that Nicolas Cage was going to tie himself onto it. And because I heard they were going to do some kind of Five Nights at Freddy style of movie, which ultimately this movie is kind of in that same vein. We ultimately have Nicolas Cage's character playing the janitor. Reasonably, we don't have Nicolas Cage say one lick of one line in this movie, and ultimately I just was ultimately content with that. I was completely and utterly happy that Nicolas Cage never says one lick of a line. Because when looking at it, Nicolas Cage has a way of looking at people and conveying a bunch of things. And recently I was kind of curious why Nicolas Cage took this role on. Was it just the fact that ultimately he loves Five Nights at Freddy, or was it the fact that ultimately he just thought that this movie was really fun? Ultimately, with all the stuff that they had Nicolas Cage do through this movie, I'm like, hopefully he didn't get hurt while doing this film. Because, good God, all the stuff that was going on and all the fight scenes that he had to do, I really just enjoyed the aspect of this movie. A lot of people will ask right away, well, is this movie scary? Is there too many jump scares? Really, for me, I watched this and there wasn't anything that kind of made me uneasy or otherwise made me jump at any point in time in this movie. which I think is great because ultimately you can just enjoy this movie for what it really is just a really fun film, really. It's one of those movies that you go in and you're just impressed by how different it is. For me, honestly, like I love how different movies are. I don't like to see the formulaic, like here's another Avengers movie popping out, here's another Marvel movie, here's another superhero film. Like I want to see how vastly different a movie can be than anything else. And so that's what ultimately impressed me about Willy's Wonderland. I really wanted to hope that it wasn't going to be just Nicolas Cage in this ringer of this Wonderland. Like I was hoping there to be kind of like a real like setup, and then I hoped that there would be like more of a payoff as we got into this film, and this movie did not disappoint. Uh, Really, it does give you like a setup for Nicolas Cage to come to the fray in this movie, and then ultimately we have it to where there is a backstory of the town, of the animatronics, and of eventually we have it to where there are more people that kind of stumble upon this Wonderland much more so than Nicolas Cage's character. And eventually we have the animatronics kind of wreaking havoc in the town as well at some points in time. Ultimately, I thought that reasonably there were some points in time where I felt some animatronics were amazing looking, and then some felt a little on the cheap side. Like I think the alligator costumed one looked to be just like they spent a ton of money on the mask, but then ultimately everything from the neck down was just like, let's just find a green thing that we can put on this guy, and that's it. Where ultimately I wasn't thinking like every single thing was going to be in huge detail. When looking at it, you have like a gorilla costume that, for the most point, just looks like kind of your basic standard gorilla costume, but that doesn't not make it very impressive. Um, but when looking at it, I'm kind of over. I'm kind of it's kind of a nitpick because when looking at it, all these things look visually amazing. There were so much time being put into every single one of these, especially the face parts of every single character. Everything looks freaking awesome. And so for any little tiny little, like, if anything, I'm just complaining about silly stuff as far as the animatronics goes, because good God, I'm sure that took like a ton of money and like it was a very probably difficult process to do any lick of any of these animatronic characters. There were some times where I felt that I wished that the characters were a little bit more robotic, because I think there was some times where we kind of got to a point where the animatronics seemed a little bit too lifelike. Like they were basically just like walking around like a normal person and whatever. I wish that they were kind of even more like robotic and kind of like chunky, and like their movements were kind of much more like Peter Waller from the movie RoboCop. Like everything is very like staccato and like robotic and like movements and stuff like that. Because I don't think we quite get enough of that in this film. I wish we could have had really more, to where even where maybe maybe one of the animatronics was going to kill somebody, but like bizarrely, like their movements were going too slow, and ultimately like it couldn't get to somebody in time and kill them. I thought that that would have been really cool if ultimately it was kind of like a slow kill. And sometimes you can kind of play that up because we'll have somebody who is very like overly scared and is frozen to let's just say like a wall. Like I seen this in Friday the 13th Part 2, where you just have a girl that's frozen into a wall and Jason comes up to him and ultimately just kind of slowly but surely kills her. Like, I wish that they could have kind of done that with like the slow animatronics, where ultimately is like it would be a slow kill. But I'm sure that this movie probably also didn't have like a budget to have it to where you can slowly see like a knife or something going into someone. Because I think a lot of the kills were rushed kills, or it was quite obviously cut to showcase that, like, okay, we're gonna do this and this and this, but then when looking at it, like, you can kind of see like how they could have cut this movie. But again, um, that is not to belittle this film. I thought that this film was like man, the editing bay of this movie, or whatever, the editing, the overall approach of it and everything, I was like, bravo. Like, because ultimately you can kind of tell where it seems that some of the scenes kind of feel cheap, but then also you can see in other scenes where like the visual of it is just really on par. So it's like, it seems like some things here and there kind of seem to me to like dip in quality at some point, but like there is like a bunch of like shadow-ish like work and just overall making this movie look way more impressive than anything, uh, and this and that. So if anything, really, I think the for the most point, you can tell within this movie what dialogue that they really deemed important in this film. Like, there's some people in this movie that are just kind of going off and off and off and off and off, and you can just tell that their dialogue does not matter in this movie. And I thought that that was the most interesting thing about this film. I'm like, okay, so you're obviously putting dialogue into a person that ultimately it's blatantly obvious that their dialogue doesn't matter. It's like, I guess that's kind of like the incentive on just like, well, hey, this person really wanted lines in this movie, and so ultimately he was just going and rambling off of weird and or bizarre, crazy like stuff, and you can really tell in this film where the dialogue actually matters, and that's the thing that I liked about this film is it gives you dialogue that doesn't matter, but then really tells you like, okay, like, but tune into this kind of thing. And so I could really appreciate it for that approach. But yeah, I think that's all I want to say in a very cryptic like sense for this movie, and let's bust out into that double fived spoiler time. And man, I just really enjoyed this movie. I really did. Hopefully, a lot of people will be eventually to see this movie and go out of the way to say that they saw it. It's a real fun thromp. For people who aren't even Five Nights at Freddy fans, just go on and watch this movie anyways. If you're a horror fan, you'll probably enjoy this movie. If you're not a horror fan, you'll probably still enjoy this movie regardless. Because reasonably, it's just a one of a kind like film that you're probably maybe not going to see again, because ultimately I just feel that there probably isn't going to be a sequel, sadly. I wish that there probably would be, and I feel like this movie isn't set up to be a sequel, which kind of sucks. Uh, but when looking at it, um, then ultimately, like, I'm sure that they can go and experiment and do all kinds of things, but then again, who knows how much money that this movie costs to do and how much they're going to get back on it. So, yeah. Hopefully, we can kind of get the word out and ultimately have it to where people will want to see this on some streaming service somewhere or on Amazon right now for $20 and have like everybody and your friends just come and watch this together. And then, yeah. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So really, I'm gonna have a problem saying which animatronic is which, because ultimately there is some portions of here where we ultimately have it to where there are names of certain characters, but when looking at it, like not everything is going to be plopped down everywhere. Um, so ultimately, there's going to be some issues in whichever to ultimately kind of go through this at some point. But anyways, and plus there's a lot of animatronics. There's like 8 of them in this movie. So we ultimately go along and we have it to where the first thing that we see are 2 people in Willy's Wonderland, and we are to naturally assume that slowly but surely these 2 people are going to end up dead because they're not Nicolas Cage. So we go on and these 2 people are hiding, and ultimately we have it to where we have the TV screen that ultimately is showcasing the old fashioned "it's your birthday and you're going to have fun," and basically like there's quite a bit of songs that are in this movie that I think are specifically done for this film, which bravo for that, because I was naturally assuming that they were going to have to do like some kind of like I didn't think that there was going to actually be original music for this movie. I was concerned that ultimately it was going to end up being that they were going to have to go in and like have to kind of like create music that already exists under different kind of circumstances or whatever. Um, but man, just enjoyable. So going into here, we have it to where quite easily we have it to where the animatronics are ultimately killing these 2 people with a TV screen that ultimately slaps blood on it, and that is the intro. So we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage's character is ultimately a person that doesn't say one word in this film. We ultimately have it to where Nicolas Cage ends up going and driving through this road that ultimately has road spikes. And I'm like, oh, so I'm thinking immediately right away in my head, I'm like, okay, so there's some plan of how to sucker all these people into this Willy's Wonderland. Like immediately I was thinking, I'm like, okay, there has to be something going on with this town immediately from just one incident of there being road spikes in the road to ultimately stop Nicolas Cage. He pops every single one of his tires, and we have it to where the AAA guy ultimately towing Nicolas Cage's vehicle ultimately is telling him like, well, hey, like he's telling him every single thing that ultimately had happened with the scene and all kinds of stuff, like kind of regaling about stories and things along those natures, and Nicolas Cage is not hearing a word that this guy is saying, and ultimately just kind of going on into just kind of just pure just looking outside of uh, the windshield basically, or out the window, just kind of just, and we have this guy going ba 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 ba. So we end up having it to where there is Liz and a seemingly a group of kids, but it's mostly just Liz right now, who is ultimately to try to pour gasoline all over Willy's Wonderland. And ultimately, before she lights it, we end up having the police end up going and finding her and grabbing her and arresting her. Ultimately, we have it to where Sheriff Lund is Liz's mother, we are to assume. And so ultimately, Sheriff lets Liz go free because ultimately, Sheriff's kid. So we end up having it to where the tow truck guy ends up bringing in Nicolas Cage's character, because Nicolas Cage's character is just called the janitor because, again, he doesn't have a name, he never says anything, and that's great. So we have it where ultimately the tow truck driver is ultimately telling the sheriff what had all happened with with Nicolas Cage's character, and sheriff is ultimately just like, okay. So we end up having it to where the tow truck driver is ultimately calling because the tow truck driver knows a way that this guy can work off all of his popped tires, And so we end up having it to where this tow truck driver calls Tex, who ultimately is a guy who owns Willy's Wonderland. And I'm like, oh, okay, so like this is kind of like the setup. Like this is like a bizarre setup for this town, but I want to eventually figure out why, and eventually we'll get there. So we end up having Tex explain to Nicolas Cage basically as soon as he gets this job, knowing full well that Nicolas Cage is just going to take this job. So we have it to where Tex ultimately explains the backstory of this establishment that ultimately he just bought this establishment and wants it cleaned up. And because ultimately the previous owners had died, let's just say, and so ultimately like Tex just kind of inherited it or bought it or whatever. So we end up having it to where Tex ultimately showcases the TV that had blood on it before, but now doesn't have blood on it. Ultimately showcasing the song and dance that ultimately had been performed in the earlier part of this movie. And so Tex is ultimately kind of talking about the history a little bit of this place. To ultimately they used to have like chili dogs and all kinds of things, which I'm ultimately like, okay, so in Five Nights at Freddy it was a pizza joint. For this one it's chili dogs. I'm like, okay, that's actually brilliant. I was thinking that it was going to be like, what is going to be the most common food that they're going to serve there? And immediately when I thought of chili dogs, I'm like, well, yeah, like baseball. Like you'd have like chili dogs and stuff like that all the time there. I'm thinking, wouldn't you have gotten into like of course you probably couldn't do burgers. Like I think that that's been done to death. So it had to be some kind of common food equivalent. And like ultimately, if it's not pizza, then it's like they would have went and if they would have went with pizza, they would have probably been sued. But ultimately, if considering they went into hot dogs, because ultimately I think they had to ultimately change the name of a lot of the characters in the movie because ultimately they were going to probably get sued via that too. It's like, good God, like I'm sure this movie like had to deal with so much like research and everything like that to make sure that they were going to get like sued by somebody. But anyways, going in here, so we have it to where Tex is ultimately laying out that this guy just has to spend one night at Willy's Wonderland and clean this whole place up. And so ultimately, we have it to where Tex gives Nicolas Cage, who is now called the janitor, a T-shirt that says Willy's Wonderland, and ultimately tells him like, "Hey, you're part of the staff." The funny thing is, we consistently have the janitor ultimately consistently needing numerous shirts to wear throughout the entire night. We just see consistent sequences of the janitor ultimately going back into the cleaning facility to take off one shirt to put on another, and we're going to consistently see that throughout the entire night because every single time the janitor ultimately gets so much black goop all over him or whatever. So we end up having it to where the guy has ultimately told the janitor, Tex had told the janitor like, hey, like you can kind of pace yourself as much as you want. You can ultimately take breaks and all kinds of things and kind of just like ultimately if you get the job done, like doesn't matter how long it takes you kind of thing. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so Tex ends up leaving and we have it to where Nicolas Cage is ultimately just kind of cleaning up. It seems that ultimately he's going and just kind of like sweeping by the stage, and so ultimately while we start to have Nicolas Cage start kind of like sweeping and dusting around the stage area, eventually we slowly but surely eventually see that the animatronics are shifting a little and starting to move just a little bit. And to ultimately we have it to where Nicolas Cage consistently turns back at the animatronics and they don't move. To ultimately he keeps whipping and or keeps mopping. I mean, and then eventually we have it to where one of the animatronics gets closer. I believe I'm probably gonna start getting the names wrong out of all these, but ultimately it is the ostrich, Ozzy Ostrich, who is the first one to try to go at Nicolas Cage. So we ultimately slowly but surely start to see this ostrich ultimately get like a seemingly a light on him, and then ultimately have it to where the ostrich starts moving in like shifts, kind of like Five Nights at Freddy, where like eventually you turn the light on and turn the light off, and the ostrich like shifts and then shifts and then shifts to where it just basically gets blatantly like a foot or two away, or a couple foot away from Nicolas Cage. So we ultimately have it to where Nicolas Cage is like sensing movement, and so ultimately Nicolas Cage turns around to see the ostrich there. And so we have it to where ultimately Nicolas Cage just like keeps like poking it with a stick, and then eventually we have it to where the ostrich says like, "I'm gonna eat your face." So ultimately we have it to where the ostrich ends up like kind of pecking at him, to ultimately he ends up cutting a part of his face, to where eventually he just slaps duct tape on it and just goes about his business eventually after this ostrich is eventually taken care of. So we reasonably have it to where every single one of these, we just have it to where Nicolas Cage, for the most point, ends up just kind of ripping off the heads of most of these, or in this case in point, we have it to where Nicolas Cage is taking a broom and breaking the broom into little sticks and just kind of like batting his way through this ostrich. And then eventually we have it to where Nicolas Cage's character ends up ripping the metal spine out of this ostrich and eventually just tearing this ostrich apart. It looks freaking awesome. And so we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage just puts the ostrich all in a garbage bag and then tries to take this item and try to throw it away out back in the garbage, but he realizes that there are chains on the door to ultimately the janitor cannot get out. So we end up having it to where it seems that Nicolas Cage is doing a really good job cleaning everything up. It looks amazing. And so next we end up having it be that ultimately Nicolas Cage is going to shift to start cleaning the bathroom. And so ultimately we have it to where and Nicolas Cage is taking like breaks in between. Eventually we see Nicolas Cage go, because ultimately he's drinking this like punch pop or whatever that has like a fist on it and it looks hilarious. Like I'm ultimately assuming that they were maybe going to try to merchandise maybe the punch after this, but or maybe they were just going and saying like, well, he has to drink something or he has to have something while he's on his breaks, and why not just do something fun with Nicolas Cage's beverages. And so ultimately we have it to where Nicolas Cage also, while he's on his breaks, he realizes that he sees some God, what is it called? A pinball machine. There we go. And so ultimately he ends up going and cleaning this pinball machine off, and while he's on his longer breaks, he ends up playing with it. He ends up going on a break no matter what is happening with any other people, because we'll get with that with what is going on with the other people that eventually come into the fray of this movie. So we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage goes to the bathroom and starts spraying around all into the bathroom and starts heavily cleaning it. And I'm like, man, that's got to be some real like cleaning spray that can ultimately clean all of that stuff, to the point of just like you could really see everything eventually, like all that graffiti. Like, man, you just spray that thing on there and it just wipes clean. And I thought that that was utterly absurd. So we eventually seem to have Nicolas Cage eventually clean all up in this bathroom. And so eventually, when Nicolas Cage goes out of the bathroom and comes back, we end up finding that Gus the gorilla had placed a calling card for the janitor to let him know that it's his birthday, which ultimately he put that in blood. I think ultimately Nicolas Cage went out to the stage to ultimately see them doing a song of which, because ultimately at some point in time we have it to where Nicolas Cage consistently goes out to the stage to just kind of see what they do. And ultimately we have it to where at some points they have certain songs and stuff like that that go along with what is to go on in certain scenes. And anyways, so we have it to where the janitor ends up going to the bathroom, and we end up finding out that Gus Gorilla wants to go and play hide and go seek. And so we end up having Nicolas Cage ultimately going through every bathroom stall and end up like opening every door. And we have Gus Gorilla going, "Oh, you're getting warmer. Oh, you're getting hot. Oh my god!" And so ultimately, we have it to where Nicolas Cage opens every single door, and Gus is not in any one of them, it seems. But then eventually, we have Gus eventually crashing or swinging through one of the doors to ultimately grab onto Nicolas Cage and attack him. Ultimately, we have it to where Nicolas Cage is kind of like it kind of feels like they're like wrestling, or it's kind of like a wrestling move where they're just kind of almost like the gorilla is grabbing on to Nick, and Nick is grabbing onto the gorilla, and they're trying to like overpower one another. But eventually we have it to where Nicolas Cage ends up going and like outpowering this gorilla, and he ends up taking a urinal, and he takes the gorilla's head and smashes it into the urinal, and he continues to like put his foot into the gorilla's face repetitively to break this gorilla's head. So that's numero dos down. So ultimately we are to get into having more of the other people show up at one point, because we ultimately have it to where the janitor character ends up tossing another gorilla in front of the door to eventually be thrown out. So we end up having it to where the kids ultimately are coming back into the fray, with ultimately Liz with them. We ultimately have what is to believed to be Bob, Liz, Kathy, which doesn't have a last name, Aaron, and Dan, and Chris. So quite a few kids. So we end up having it to where all these kids were all pouring gasoline right in front of Willy's Wonderland. But we have it to where Liz is ultimately saying like, well, we can't burn the place down. Ultimately, that janitor guy is still in here, so I'm going to try to rescue him and get him out of here, and ultimately then he'll be saved. I'm like, well, why couldn't you have guys like ran out, got some bolt cutters, and saved him that way? Would have been a thought. So ultimately we have it to where and I'm not sure exactly which animatronic goes into this scene. It might have been the lizard. I'm not sure. But anyway, so we have it to where Liz ends up going through the ventilation system of Willy's Wonderland to get into this place via via the ventilation. And so we end up having Liz going through this ventilation, trying to figure out how she can get to Nick's character, and we eventually have it to where all of a sudden the animatronics are coming and trying to come after Liz in this ventilation. And to ultimately, I was like, yeah, classic Five Nights at Freddy. Where ultimately, normally we wouldn't have a ventilation thing. Ultimately, we would just have to close the ventilation shafts at some point. And ultimately, we would have certain animatronics coming through the ventilations and stuff along those lines. Or ultimately, we'd have to turn on some light to ultimately get some animatronic to go away. So we ultimately have it to where it seemingly we have the alligator, which is Artie Alligator, and we ultimately had I want to Cammy Chameleon, yeah, Cammy Chameleon, ultimately going into the ventilation shaft and ultimately trying to get Liz, but we have it to where Liz ends up kicking the alligator and eventually going on into an opening to ultimately she gets out of the ventilation and to where the animatronics don't go after her. So we have it to where eventually that Liz is making her way to ultimately try to get to the janitor, and eventually we have it to where the rest of the kids are on the rooftop, evidently, and they are otherwise saying some of them are kind of like Bob, and I think like Bob is the main character that ultimately is with the dreads. That is ultimately kind of mentioning that it's like, you know what, this is crazy. Like, you know what, I'm out of here. Like, ultimately, I'm not going to try to go into this Wonderland and ultimately get killed. So, you know what? I'm peacing out. Ultimately, we lead Kathy and both Kathy and Bob to ultimately go into really trying to get into some bedroom business in this Willy's Wonderland. So reasonably for them, like they have to be in this movie anyways, because there has to be some sex in this film eventually. So going into here, so we have it to where everybody is complaining about like where their lives are going to lead them before this night is over, and Bob is ultimately complaining that he doesn't want to die, and ultimately Bob thinks that Chris is an idiot for thinking that they are going to go into any part of this Wonderland to ultimately probably get killed because of Liz. Because ultimately, Chris is only having a one-track mind to help Liz, but when looking at it, really Chris should ultimately just count his blessings that, like, that ultimately he is not seemingly going to be a part of this Wonderland until they accidentally have it to where the roof is way too weak. It seems that everybody bizarrely all falls from the roof into, coincidentally, a bunch of like they fall into this like ball tent or this ball trench, and I'm like, well, yeah, like that has got to be the most like convenient, safe way for them to end up going from the roof, falling and not getting hurt, which is just to fall into this like ball tent like thing, or this ball like this ball bowl area. Anyways, so we end up having it to where Liz ultimately spots her friends, and in the end, they all get together to make their way to talk to the janitor, which is basically this janitor is not giving a rip about any single thing that these kids are saying, and ultimately, he's not saying a word still either. We ultimately have it to where Liz is ultimately telling us the backstory of this town, ultimately the backstory of this place and everything like that. So we end up having Liz telling us that ultimately the previous owners of this place had ultimately all gone and done individual personas. It seems that ultimately we had a previous owner that was Jerry Robert Willis, that ultimately he would uh, ultimately be under the disguise of Willy Weasel, because we end up having it to where it seems that uh, we have the animatronics, but then we also have it to where there's some people that are putting on the mascotted attire and ultimately going and killing people at this party as well. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably every single one of the previous people that had owned this place were all evidently near close to crazy and or serial killers, and they all had their own personas. So we end up finding out that it seems that the owner would go and have these special private parties where ultimately we have it to where the owner would dress as Willy the Weasel and go and kill a kid who is having his special birthday party with him and his parents. And so ultimately, it seems that after the numerous times of eventually this seemingly Wonderland at some point smelling and being awful and whatever, that ultimately people were getting missing persons reports, I'm sure. We end up having it to where they end up doing some investigation about Willy's Wonderland, and we have it to where ultimately every single one of those creepy Ash-like people ultimately had all decided to do some dark magic ritual that ultimately ended up sacrificing all their lives to otherwise transfer themselves from their human bodies onto these animatronics. And so I was like, man, like I really like the fact that like this movie kind of goes out of its way to actually give you a full-fledged backstory about everybody and justifies everything. And that's the thing that I ultimately liked about this film. Here's the thing that I didn't quite understand though. It kind of like you would have thought that we would really had like a small build up at first where we had like the owner being just having Willy the Weasel, and then ultimately like another guy would come in and that would be the gorilla and so on and so forth. Like slowly but surely they would start to add people over time, and but they can do that in a very quick montaging of just like, oh, okay, well, and this guy came in and so ultimately they added this character and so on and so forth, or these two people came in and added to this band over time. So, or ultimately kind of really quickly glazed over like who those people actually were at some point. But anyways, so we end up having Liz ultimately telling that ultimately even after this place had been closed down because ultimately these people had been sacrificed, ultimately Tex reopened it, and ultimately after reopening it they found that seemingly the animatronics were kind of moving all on their own, or ultimately would be playing stuff all on their own, or ultimately would just start eating and hurting people and all kinds of things. Tex ultimately just mentioned that there was accidents that happened before where people would just start to climb all over the animatronics, and that is the reason why ultimately he had to shut this down. But he was going to try to reopen it. So, but we end up finding out the truth that Liz ultimately had said that recently the town, as well as the sheriff and everybody, had orchestrated to have people that were out of towners that they did not know end up being consistently sacrificed to Willy's Wonderland, so that way ultimately these animatronics wouldn't go out at night and just seek out anybody in this town. Ultimately, if they were to take out of towners and sacrifice them to Willy's Wonderland, that ultimately they would be completely fine about everything. the animatronics would leave them alone, and ultimately everything would go back to normal if they just continue to sacrifice these people to the Wonderland. So we end up having it to where Liz is desperate to try to get the janitor from out of this environment, and ultimately says, "Yeah, hey, let's all go. Let's all go. Let's all get out of here." And of course, the janitor will not leave. So we end up having it to where ultimately, uh, I believe just the janitor and Liz are ultimately in the what is to be Nicolas Cage's break room, and because we ultimately have it to where Nicolas Cage is taking a break, a pretty long break. It seems that eventually uh, he's going and doing a the pinball machine, and ultimately having some fun doing that. To the point to where eventually we see some montages of him like being excited or him dancing or whatever. It looks really interesting. So we have it to where all the kids are eventually going out to see Willy the Weasel and all the other whoever is left to ultimately sing and dance for these kids. And ultimately we have the traditional "it's your birthday and you're gonna have fun," and then ultimately we have it to where Willy ends up transitioning, and then ultimately like, "It's your birthday and you're going to have fun and we're going to kill everyone," and then eventually we have it to where Willie ends up breaking into this like six hens song or something like that, and for ultimately we are to basically showcase that's like, yeah, all of these people, like, they're nothing people, so they're all gonna get filleted and killed right now, and surefire enough. So we end up having it to where Bob and Kathy go into the to the special room, uh, the fun room, and so we have it to ultimately Kathy goes into this fun room with a disco ball and everything like that, and so ultimately she is to go and get put a happy birthday uh, thing upon her head, and ultimately Kathy is ultimately getting really hot about all this situation, and we have to where Bob is like, "Dude, you're like a real freak, aren't you?" And she's like, "Yeah." Like basically, evidently, her getting scared gets her hot, or ultimately being in a creepy environment evidently gets her hot. So we end up having it to where ultimately Kathy is to zip her top to ultimately tell us that ultimately it seems that Bob and Kathy are going to get busy while ultimately being watched by quite possibly maybe an animatronic in their future. So we end up having it to where, okay, so we have it to where Aaron Powers ultimately is going to get a little bit of a nighty night. It seems like this character is ultimately going to get a knife through the stomach, and we end up saying goodbye to poor old Aaron. We ultimately have it to where Liz ends up going out and noticing that Aaron is to be stabbed in the chest. It seems that ultimately everyone else is going off to the fray to otherwise hide away from seemingly the Nighty Night character. So we ultimately have it to where Dan is going off on his own to quite possibly get killed, which we can probably confirm that later. We are to eventually have it to where also like some of the animatronics are going about their own. Because eventually we have it to where Liz is to go into this seemingly almost horror-esque like part of this Wonderland, to where it seems like some kind of forest, and we end up having eventually Siren Sarah ultimately kind of in a spider-like way, but she's not actually a spider. She looks a little bit like Tinkerbell to me, a little bit. And we end up having her just kind of bizarrely like climbing up from these trees and like climbing up through these walls and stuff like that. She's kind of a spider-esque like character, but she doesn't look like a spider. She looks very Tinkerbell-esque with a mixture of just having some weird bizarre spider ability. Her mouth kind of just goes into this very blackened, weird looking mouthpiece, which I thought was really interesting. So we eventually have the other kids, ultimately Chris hiding away, ultimately in this space arcade portion. And so we end up having it to where while everyone is quite possibly going to get killed soon, every single time we have it to where the janitor is ultimately just taking a break. He doesn't give a single F about anybody else but himself. So ultimately he's just taking his break while everyone is going to obviously die, which I thought was hilarious. So we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage comes back from his break to ultimately see the Nighty Night character ultimately going in and trying to attack some people. So we end up having it to where, as per usual, Nicolas Cage ends up going in on this Nighty Night character and ends up getting to the point of like seemingly like thrusting this character down, and eventually Nicolas Cage gets the knife of this character and ultimately ends up taking this Nighty Night character down. I think he ends up like chopping off his head, because that's the thing to, I guess, defeat every single one of these characters. You got to do something with every single one of their heads. I don't know why it's a thing, but evidently it's a thing in this movie. So we end up going and showcasing what happens to all of the other people, because all of the other people end up, for the most point, being safe. Eventually, Liz ends up going and consistently being in this forest-like location with Siren Sarah, and eventually we have it to where Siren consistently keeps sneaking up behind Liz, but we end up having it to where Liz ultimately just keeps like kind of attacking Siren Sarah, and ultimately even getting a knife into Siren Sarah, and we have it to where ultimately Nick ultimately makes his way to bumping into Liz, and we have it to where eventually that Nick ends up taking the knife from Liz at some point, and ultimately just kind of like taking it and is like, "Meh, like this is gonna be my knife now. I don't care." So we end up having it to where we have to now showcase what happens to everyone else that ultimately is at some point going to die. So let's go and talk about Bob and Kathy. So have it to where Bob and Kathy are getting it on within, I think, a pool or something like that. And so we ultimately have it to where, like, Kathy just has she still has a bra on, but ultimately she is having it to where she is consistently getting it with Bob, but when looking at it, she is consistently breaking her concentration because the alligator consistently keeps shifting into the room, and I think she's seeing it slightly shift somehow. We have it to where Bob is ultimately saying like, "Hey, get in the game," kind of thing. Like if anything, we have these animatronics and stuff like that. They're everywhere in this place. So looking at it, like yeah, like Bob is ultimately just wanting to finish the business, so to speak. So we end up having it to where Kathy keeps getting her concentration broken by this alligator, and eventually we have it to where just the alligator ends up just shifting into a completely different part of the room, bizarrely, and we have it to where eventually, while Kathy is riding Bob, we have it to where the alligator is riding on Bob's arm by basically eating Bob's arm, as well as just basically eating Bob at some point. We eventually have it to where Kathy jumps off of Bob and otherwise tries to get out of said door, and ultimately good luck with that because ultimately the door is locked. So we end up having Liz and the janitor making their way to try and save Kathy, but oh god, is it just too late. What a coincidence that ultimately both Kathy and Bob forcibly have to die. I'm like, yeah, I was kind of assuming that that was going to happen. And plus, also, when you have a woman that is basically doing the business every single time, both man and woman usually have to die, and eventually, usually the the sex active woman and or man usually has to die in this film. It's the stereotypical thing of any horror movie. So we go on into this, and ultimately Nicolas Cage ends up breaking the door down to ultimately lead them to ultimately just see the dead bodies, and that's about reasonably it, I think, for the most point. We eventually have it to where eventually Nick is to get attacked by the alligator, and we have it to where Nicolas Cage ends up opening up the seemingly the both sides of the upper teeth and the bottom teeth. He ends up just stretching them out, and then ultimately he ends up grabbing into the mouth of it and pulling out a piece to ultimately kill this animatronic. Again, everything has to do with something to do with the mouth consistently. So, or with the face, meaning. Anyways, so we end up also having Tito the Turtle and also Siren Sarah end up going and appearing seemingly in a hallway when Liz and the janitor ends up leaving this room. We have it to where basically the janitor just kind of like smacks those two away for them to just keep continually walking further. Basically, like, he doesn't completely kill both of them. He just kind of like leaves them off to ultimately, like, we're going to come back to those two things at some point in time. So we end up having it to where Dan ultimately is to be the guy with the glasses. He goes into, I believe, some bathroom of sorts to ultimately get killed by Siren Sarah and I think the chameleon, but I could be wrong about that. So ultimately we have it to where Dan ends up getting murdered horribly, and I could not care, to be brutally honest. Like, ultimately his death wasn't important in the way that they shot this. Didn't feel like his death was at all important. Like, it was kind of sad because I felt like this character, like, you could tell where he was important in the ring of things, so ultimately it made his death, like, inconsequential to the rest of the story. It was just like, dude, they could have just killed this guy really super quick, and no one would have cared. Because ultimately this guy didn't have one lick of much of any lines, and none of what he did say actually mattered, so... Like, ultimately, I would have, like, I felt bad for whoever played Dan because it just felt like he was just unimportant to the whole portion of the story. So, we have it to where ultimately the sheriff and some state police officer are ultimately waiting at some bat phone to ultimately hear a ring-a-ling-a-ding-ding to ultimately know whether or not they have to go to Willy's Wonderland or not. Because ultimately they are assuming that all heck is going to break loose at Willy's Wonderland, and so ultimately the sheriff is just waiting for the call. Ultimately, we have it to where Chris is giving the sheriff a little ding-a-ling-ling, and we have it to where at first sheriff is kind of wavering off as some prank, like in the movie Killer Clowns from Outer Space, where we have it to where the sheriff is ultimately playing it off consistently as some prank, that ultimately the whole entire town is in on some prank. And so, but we have it to where Chris is consistently calling the sheriff, and ultimately the sheriff has to forcibly go out and ultimately go out into Willy's Wonderland. So we end up having it to where reasonably we have it to where Chris ultimately is getting the phone call, and we have it to where Cammy the chameleon is making her way to Chris, and she's ultimately stating, it's like, hey, I'm going to let you know that I'm actually not like all the other animatronics. Like, if anything, like, I'm not going to hurt you. And, like, she's talking all this innocence, and she's talking that, like, she wants to just be free of all this and everything like that. And Chris, being this really nice person, believes all of this. So we end up having it to where Chris ultimately goes to the animatronic, and, like, she's very convincing, and we have it to where like Chris is ultimately talking to this animatronic, and it seems all well and good, and we have it to where Liz is to make her way to Chris, and we still assume that Chris and the chameleon, everything's gonna be fine, and ultimately the chameleon is gonna work for Liz and Chris, and everything's gonna be perfectly fine. And then we have it to where the chameleon ultimately sticks her tongue out, stretches out her tongue to ultimately wrap around Chris's neck, and ultimately snaps Chris's neck, and then ultimately we have it to where the chameleon ultimately ends up going for Liz, and all bets are off. So we end up having it to where eventually, as per usual, we have it to where the janitor ends up trying to save Liz. But here is the thing. So the chameleon does not die at this point. We ultimately have it to where Liz and the janitor end up seemingly getting away from the chameleon, and we eventually have it to where these people end up to eventually almost making their way out of this facility. Because ultimately we have it to where the sheriff is ultimately going to, I think, take off one of the chains for the door and ultimately go into the Wonderland and to ultimately see what's going on with their shotguns and whatever and what have you. So we end up having it to where the state police officer is grabbing Liz to ultimately take her off into being safe, and we have it to where the sheriff is otherwise taking the janitor's character and ultimately, I think, tying him up. I thought they were cuffing him, but ultimately, when looking at it, I'm like, I think they just tied him up, because when looking, they might have just like zip tied his arm. Because I'm like, if they were to cuff him, I'm like, how is it that he ends up getting free eventually? Because it ultimately looked like they just tied him up bizarrely. It makes no sense. Anyways, so we end up having it to where the sheriff ultimately like tells about the sacrifices that have been happening repetitiously from year to year to year. That ultimately they kind of mention every single little out of towner Ash-like person that had been sacrificed to Willy the Weasel and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Liz and the state trooper end up going off, and the sheriff ultimately ends up telling the janitor that ultimately he's going to get sacrificed, and boo-hoo for him. Like, sorry, you're the out-of-towner that has to get sacrificed. So we end up having it to where the janitor is cuffed, and the sheriff ends up going and ends up walking away and saying, "Hey, come and get him," kind of thing. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so we have it to where the janitor is supposedly tied and left to be sacrificed, and so we have it to where both the chameleon and the Siren Sarah ends up going into like, yeah, you want a menage a trois kind of thing, like, hey, like, so we end up having it to where ultimately, even with his hands tied behind his back, we still have it seemingly where Nicolas Cage is still going to attack these animatronics. It's like, god dang, Nicolas Cage. So we end up having it to where ultimately Nicolas Cage ends up like bum rushing the animatronics, knocking them down, and like end up just knocking both these animatronics down with his hands tied behind his back. And so we have to where eventually Nicolas Cage like is sitting on Siren Sarah's neck, and ultimately he is taking his like thighs and taking his knees, and ultimately just trying to jostle off the head of, like, really trying to break the neck of Siren Sarah, with him basically sitting on her and kind of rocking back and forth, like trying to twist and turn Siren Sarah's neck basically off, which ultimately doesn't exactly work, but ultimately just incapacitates her for a while. We eventually have it to where At some point, Nicolas Cage ends up breaking free from his shackles to ultimately take down the chameleon, to ultimately have it to where she otherwise tries to, of course, use her tongue as a weapon. And what good does that do when we have Nicolas Cage on the roster, let's just say? So we end up having it to where reasonably the chameleon's tongue ends up becoming a moot point because when we're really looking at it, it's freaking Nicolas Cage. So we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage ends up taking down this chameleon and killing it, of course, as per the usual way. So we end up having it to where reasonably uh, ultimately have Nicolas Cage ultimately going and throwing the chameleon into the trash. He's going out of the building and tossing everything of trash into the dumpster. And we have it to where the sheriff is ultimately seeing Nicolas Cage. And we have Nicolas Cage waving to the sheriff going, "Hey, yeah, I'm really good, ain't I? Ain't I? Hmm?" And so, without saying a lick of any words, but I thought it was hilarious that Nicolas Cage is just kind of like, "Hey, how's it going? How's it going, sheriff?" And so, like, the sheriff is like, like GDSOB, blah blah. So she ends up going back into the building, and now is trying as desperately as much as she can to confirm that Nicolas Cage is going to die. So she ends up taking the shotgun, and she ends up going and holding uh, Nicolas Cage in one spot indefinitely. So ultimately, Willie the Weasel will be able to consume uh, Nicolas Cage's character. And I'm like, no, Nicolas Cage did all this work. Don't take this from him. And so now we are ultimately to say what is going on with Liz, and then we will go back into what happens with Nicolas Cage. Like, I think at some point Nicolas Cage ends up breaking a rib at some point, because ultimately we have it to where he ends up duct taping himself. I think that was in the earlier on fights. Maybe the one time where ultimately Nicolas Cage and the gorilla end up doing this like little flip kind of tumble. Maybe that caused the breaking of the ribs, or anything along those lines. So, but moving on. So we ultimately have it to where the state cop is ultimately driving off with Liz, to ultimately say that it's like, God, there's nothing I can do. Like, I want you to just feel sorry for me and blah blah blah. That ultimately I'm having to do this, like, and dot 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 dot. So we end up having seemingly Tito the turtle end up going and putting his hand into the state police officer and slicing him up, pulling him out of his car, and then ultimately going in and trying to kill the state police officer. So we end up having Tito the turtle ultimately speaking in Spanish, and so ultimately we have subtitles at the bottom, which I thought was interesting because I'm like, well, it wouldn't even matter if ultimately they had subtitles or not, because ultimately you can kind of just uh, go with the hilariousness of whatever is to go on. So we end up having it to where Liz is ultimately going to shoot um, said turtle, and we end up having it to where the turtle ends up showing the girl the shotgun shells, and so ultimately we have it to where Liz ultimately ends up just trying to beat this turtle to death with a shotgun, but she really doesn't actually 100% kill the turtle. She just beats it to death enough to where ultimately she can just run off to go back to Willy's Wonderland uh, because reasonably the janitor had saved her numerous times that ultimately she's going to go back for him. So now the conclusion of Willy's Wonderland, the big old Willy. So we have it to where now the sheriff is ultimately saying like, yeah, I'm gonna give Willy his meal. Like, I'm going to feed Willy and stuff along those lines. I'm like, and a lot of what the sheriff is kind of saying, it could be like a double worded thing to ultimately have it be that she's quite possibly going to be a meal, and surefire enough, she is. we end up having it to where Willy ends up slicing the sheriff completely in half. To where ultimately the sheriff's like one half is going one side, and you can just see her like her where her belt is down, just kind of in one just standing formation. So we end up having it to where Willy is now kind of doing some darkened games of sorts, where he's kind of playing with the lighting. We have it to where ultimately we have Nicolas Cage ultimately kind of like just seeing like these claws come out consistently, just like claws everywhere. We have it to where Nicolas Cage is getting all just kind of scratched and scraped up everywhere, and we have it to where ultimately Nicolas Cage gets so scraped up that he ends up hitting this buzzer that says it's your birthday. And so we ultimately have it to where the song goes like, "It's your birthday, go have fun." Because ultimately it's like, I guess this has been hit so often that ultimately it just sounds weird now. And it also looks like an acid trip kind of going on with Nicolas Cage just going like the camera angles look all weird and interesting. So we eventually have it to where Nicolas Cage is so scraped up from Willy, the big old Willy, that ultimately he goes into the ball tent, and we are to naturally assume that he is going to be dead, and maybe Liz is going to have to be the final girl or hero or whatever out of this movie. Because in every single horror movie, you have to have the final girl. So we end up having it to where Willy thinks that he has won. We end up having Liz making her way back here. And so we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage's character is not dead. Ultimately, he crawls out of the ball tent or whatever the heck that thing is, and he eventually goes back into the break room. Not to just go on a straight up break, but surefire enough, he could have. We ultimately have it to where Nicolas Cage's character ends up taping the two sticks from the mop together, and he ultimately ends up putting all of his energy drinks or his pop all into one sack. And now we have it to where Nicolas Cage has a weapon to ultimately go against Willy the Weasel. So we have it to where now it's a real standoff from like, yeah, this is actually awesome. Because ultimately I'm like, yeah, like this is the way that it should be. It shouldn't be that Willy ultimately just wins via doing some shady light gimmick stuff. And I thought that would have been garbage. No. We have it to where they straight up fight it out. So, like Godzilla and King Kong just ultimately looking at one another, staring one another down, and ultimately just like, yeah, you're gonna die. So we end up having to where Nicolas Cage is just flapping this thing, mostly at the neck part, because ultimately when looking at it, like, I think all that stuff was all just, like, was nothing. So ultimately that was the real reason why ultimately every single time they probably told him, hey, yeah, like, hit at the neck or hit at, like, the face part, because ultimately all of that is just wires or whatever, so you can hit that as numerous times as you want, and ultimately that'll be completely fine. That won't actually hurt the person in the actual costume, so that's probably what he ended up doing. So we have it to where Nicolas Cage is back and forth swinging the sack of pop and the sticks. Ultimately, I'm assuming in that sack there probably wasn't actually the pop in there. It's probably like maybe like a pillow or something in there, because ultimately they had to put in like sounds that ultimately sounded like nails or something, or like a stack of like nails or something being smacked or whatever. And ultimately I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound exactly like the sound that it should be. Or it just sounded kind of like an off sound that made no sense to me. Like they had to add it in later, obviously. So it didn't sound like the right sound. It didn't make sense. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Nicolas Cage is consistently bopping this head back and forth to where eventually we end up having it to where it damages the head, and he basically crushes the head repetitiously over and over to assess that there is going to be every single one of these characters all dead, with the exception of Tito the Turtle and Siren Sarah are left to be undetermined if they are absolutely dead or not. But we'll get to that. So we end up having it to where eventually we have Nicolas Cage cleaning this whole place up, spot and clean. And so Tex and the tow truck driver make their way to ultimately just be like, yeah, like another car to the collection, because ultimately when looking at it, they end up doing donuts and all kinds of things with this car. Ultimately saying like, yeah, this is a really fun car. Ultimately assessing that Nicolas Cage's character is never going to collect this at the end of the day. So Liz ends up going back in there to ultimately go and get Nicolas Cage's character, and Tex goes in there to look within the windows, ultimately to assess that neither the tow truck driver or Tex wants to go into Willy's Wonderland to see if this guy ended up getting killed or not. So we end up finding out that Tex ended up poking his eyes into the window and realizing that every single thing is clean, to where Tex is ultimately frustrated. It's like, well, what happened here? Like, what went on? So we end up having Tex go in, and ultimately we have it to where Nicolas Cage comes out of the room. He took the duct tape off of his face. We end up having it to where Nicolas Cage puts his hand out for the keys, and we end up having him take the keys, and ultimately we end up having him go on his way to ultimately go into his car, and Liz ends up going into the janitor's car because she basically has nothing left but herself. So ultimately, she just drives off into the sunset with Nicolas Cage in his car. But there's a little bit more than that. This isn't the complete 100% ending yet. So we end up having Tex and the janitor, or Tex and the tow truck driver, ultimately being like, "Well, he took out every single one of these animatronics. Like, you know what? Like, I think that there's something about this. I think we're completely 100% fine. Maybe I can reopen this place and ultimately call it something else or do something with it, have some kind of gimmick." And so we end up having Siren Sarah ends up coming out of the dumpster and going in, and like I was waiting for there to be some like back seat business going from any number of these cars to eventually to where the characters would end up dying from some backseat business. But I guess that didn't actually happen. So we end up having it to where the tow truck driver and Tex ends up getting back in their car, and we find out that Siren Liz ends up blowing up Tex's and the tow truck driver in this car. And so we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage and Liz are ultimately driving off. And so we end up having it to where Nicolas Cage ends up opening up a thing of punch, but then ultimately he gives it to Liz. And so we end up finding out while they're driving that ultimately Tito the Turtle is just kind of like in the middle of the road, just going like, "Hey, it's your birthday!" like I'm still here. And so we end up having it to where Liz just runs and annihilates this turtle to ultimately see the head go flying behind them, and all the bits and pieces to ultimately say like, "Oh yeah, there's not going to be a sequel of this one." And so they end up driving off, and that's just the end of this movie. I thought that this movie was great. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was fun. If anything, like it did have a happy ending at the end, which ultimately I was like, like I was thinking that everyone was gonna die, and then all the animatronics were gonna be fine, or ultimately there'd be some like Christine moment at the very end of this where we would just find out that these animatronics like would never die or something like that, to ultimately just have it be that yeah, Nicolas Cage did win at the end of this, but the animatronics would just Christine themselves and ultimately would go right back into the stage, and it would just start all over again. But that didn't happen. It ended up just being a happy ending where it seems that everything just resolved itself. And I just thought that this movie was so fun. Uh, if anything, there are some kind of cliche horror things going on in here, but ultimately, again, I just really enjoyed this movie for how wonderful it was. And oh my god, I spent an hour and almost 20 minutes talking about it, so I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.